The wind was no longer wind. It had become something else entirely, a living force with teeth and claws, a predator made of ice and fury. It struck the Nebraska prairie with the weight of a locomotive, driving snow so dense and so fast that a person caught within it would be blind, deaf, and frozen within minutes. The temperature had plummeted to 37 degrees below zero, and the wind made it colder still, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in the time it took to draw 3 breaths. To step outside was to invite death. To walk from one building to another, a distance of perhaps 50 feet, was to gamble with the certainty that the house would not guide you, that the wind would spin you around, that you would wander in circles until you fell and did not rise. On the morning of January 13th, 1888, 17-year-old Emmett Garrison opened the back door of his family's farmhouse in Thornfield, Nebraska, and stepped into the storm to fetch water from the well for his sick sister. The well was 200 feet away. He knew the path by heart. He had walked it 10,000 times. But the blizzard erased all paths, all memory, all direction. His family found his body 3 days later, 200 yards from the house, facing away from safety, his arms still reaching forward as if he believed home was just ahead. Emmett was not the only one. Across the northern plains, the great schoolhouse blizzard of 1888 killed over 200 people, many of them within sight of their own doorsteps. The storm was a monster that devoured the familiar, turning backyards into killing fields, transforming the simple act of walking into a death sentence. But in a small cluster of homesteads on the eastern edge of Thornfield, not a single life was lost. 31 people survived the 3-day storm without once setting foot in the open air. They moved between houses, barns, wells, and root cellars through a network of tunnels that ran beneath the frozen earth, safe from the wind that howled impotently above their heads. The woman who had dug those tunnels was named Ingrid Ashford, and until the storm proved her right, they had called her mad. She had come to Nebraska in the spring of 1881, a widow of 42 whose husband, Eric, had perished in the hard winter of '79. He had been caught in a blizzard between the house and the barn on their Minnesota homestead, gone to check on the cattle at dusk, a task he had performed 1,000 times before. The storm had risen without warning, as prairie storms so often did, and he had lost his way in the 18-yard space between the barn door and the kitchen. Ingrid had stood at that kitchen door for 6 hours, holding a lantern high, calling his name until her voice broke and her arm grew numb. She could see nothing beyond the glass but white, endless white, a wall of snow that swallowed light and sound and hope. She found him the next morning when the storm finally broke. He lay 18 yards from the front door, frozen solid, his hand outstretched toward a house he could not see. The snow around him told the story she would never forget. His footprints circled and crossed and doubled back, a map of desperation in the white. He had walked past the door 3 times. On 3 times he had been close enough to touch the wood, and 3 times the wind had spun him away. 18 yards. She knelt beside him in the bitter cold, her border collie Fenrir pressing against her leg, whimpering. Fenrir had been a wedding gift from Eric, a puppy with mismatched eyes and boundless energy, who had grown into the most loyal companion either of them had ever known. The dog had found Eric before Ingrid did, had stood guard over the frozen body through the long night, howling at a sky that offered no mercy. Ingrid took Eric's frozen hand in hers and held it until her own fingers went numb. She did not cry. The tears would come later, in the dark, in the silence, in all the years that followed. But in that moment, kneeling in the snow beside the man she had loved for 23 years, Ingrid Ashford made a vow. No one else would die because they could not find their way home. Nebraska was supposed to be a fresh start. She filed a claim on 160 acres of prairie east of Thornfield, paying the standard fee, building the standard sod house, starting the standard life of a plains homesteader. Her sorrel mare Saga pulled the plow that broke the land. Her hands, still strong despite her years, built the fences and the outbuildings. She worked from dawn to dark, as all homesteaders did, trying to outrun a grief that followed her like a shadow. The first night in her new sod house, Ingrid dreamed of Eric. He stood in a field of white, snow swirling around him, his hand reaching toward her, but he was not afraid. He was calm, peaceful, as if he had finally found the rest that had eluded him in those terrible final hours. Build the path. In Ingrid, he said, his voice cutting through the howling wind as clearly as if he stood beside her bed. Do not let anyone else die for 18 yards. She woke with tears on her face and certainty in her heart. She knew what she had to do. She was planning tunnels. Her grandfather in Norway had taught her about them when she was a child, sitting by the fire in their farmhouse in the Setesdal Valley, where winters lasted 8 months and the snow could bury a man standing upright. In the old country, he had told her, his voice rough as pine bark, we do not walk on top of the earth in winter. We walk beneath it. The ground at 5 feet deep stays 50 degrees, summer or winter. It is God's blanket, Ingrid. The Americans have forgotten this. But we remember. She remembered now. The first tunnel connected her house to her barn. She began digging in June of 1881, working in the cool of the morning and the twilight of the evening when the sun was not brutal and the soil was not baked. The prairie earth was not easy. It was dense with roots, studded with rocks, resistant to the shovel in ways that tested even her considerable determination. But Ingrid was patient. She had learned patience from grief, and grief had taught her well. She dug down 5 feet, below the frost line where her grandfather had promised the earth would stay warm, then forward, shoring up the tunnel walls with timber cut from the cottonwoods along the creek. The passage was 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall, cramped but large enough for a woman to walk hunched or for animals to be led through an emergency. She lined the floor with gravel for drainage and installed simple wooden doors at each end to control airflow and keep out vermin. Fenrir watched her work every day, lying at the tunnel entrance with his head on his paws, occasionally venturing down to sniff the fresh-turned earth. He was her only companion now, her only family, and she talked to him as she dug, telling him about Eric, about Norway, about the winters that had shaped her grandfather's wisdom. The tunnel was 60 feet long. It took her 3 months to complete. When she emerged from the barn end on a September morning, squinting in the sunlight, her neighbor to the north happened to be riding past. Cornelius Blackwood was the wealthiest man in the Thornfield settlement, owner of 320 acres, employer of 2 hired men. He was 48 years old, with a face weathered by sun and wind and an air of authority that he wore like a Sunday coat. He considered himself the natural leader of the community, and he had opinions about everything. He reined in his bay mare and stared at the woman climbing out of a hole in the ground, dirt streaking her face, a shovel in her hand. Mrs. Ashford, he called, his voice carrying the particular tone of a man who is about to say something he finds amusing. What in God's name are you building? A grave? Ingrid set down her shovel and wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. Fenrir emerged from the tunnel behind her, shaking dirt from his black and white coat. A tunnel, she replied, connects the house to the barn. Blackwood stared at her. Then he laughed, a loud braying sound that rolled across the prairie like distant thunder. A tunnel. You have dug a tunnel to your barn, 60 feet underground, so you do not have to walk 60 feet above ground. He shook his head in amazement, his mustache twitching with mirth. The sun has cooked your brain, woman. That is the only explanation. Ingrid said nothing. She had learned long ago that some people could not be convinced with words. They could only be convinced with time. You will see, she said quietly, and went back to her work. Word of Ingrid's tunnel spread through Thornfield within days. At the general store, at the church, at the schoolhouse, where the children gathered to learn their letters, the Norwegian widow and her underground passage became the subject of endless amusement. The Ashford woman is digging to China, the men joked at the store, slapping their knees. Sorry, she means to become a mole, the women whispered at the sewing circle, their needles flashing. Mole woman, the children called her, giggling behind their hands when she passed. Cornelius Blackwood, who enjoyed his role as the community's leading citizen, made Ingrid's project a personal crusade. At a gathering at his homestead where the leading families had assembled for a harvest celebration, he held forth at length about the unfortunate widow from Minnesota. The woman is not right in the head, he declared, his voice booming across the laden tables. First her husband freezes to death, and now she spends her days underground like some kind of burrowing creature. It is unhealthy, unnatural, and frankly, it is an embarrassment to the settlement. His wife Dorothea, a sharp-featured woman with a talent for gossip, nodded vigorously. Well, I feel sorry for her, truly I do. The grief has clearly unhinged her. But tunnels? Whatever will people think of Thornfield? Reverend Josiah Crane, the settlement's Methodist minister, weighed in with theological concerns. Living beneath the earth like a rodent is contrary to God's design, he pronounced. The Lord created man to walk upright on the surface of his creation, not to burrow like the beasts. Dr. Franklin Mercer, who had trained in medicine at a college back east and never let anyone forget it, offered a scientific perspective. The air in underground passages is notoriously unhealthy, full of noxious vapors. Mark my words, the woman will develop consumption before winter. Young Jasper Tully, a farmhand of 22 with more energy than sense, made the matter a subject of gambling. $5 says she gives up before the first snow, he announced at the store. Any takers? There were many takers. The odds, they all agreed, were heavily in Jasper's favor. The laughter and the whispers continued through the fall and into the winter. But Ingrid did not stop. She could not stop. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Eric grasping at empty air where the door should have been. If you are watching from somewhere, the winters bite hard. From Minnesota or Montana or any place where the wind can kill you in 10 minutes, let us know in the comments where you are joining us from today. And if you have not already, subscribe now. This story is only beginning, and you will not want to miss what happens when walking outside becomes impossible. Through 1882 and 1883, where Ingrid expanded her tunnel system, a second passage connected her house to the well house, ensuring that water could be fetched without stepping outside. A third ran from the barn to the chicken coop. A fourth led to the root cellar where provisions could be retrieved in any weather. Her homestead became an underground web, 400 feet of tunnel linking every structure on her property. The cost in labor was enormous. Her hands blistered and bled and calloused over. Her back ached constantly. Her shoulders grew hard with muscle that no woman in Thornfield possessed. The cost in materials was substantial as well. Timber for shoring, gravel for flooring, doors and hardware, and the endless small necessities of construction. But Ingrid had no husband, no children, no obligations beyond her own survival. She spent her money on lumber instead of luxuries, her time on digging instead of socializing. The neighbors watched with a mixture of pity and scorn. The tunnels became a local legend, a cautionary tale about what happened when a woman let grief consume her reason. Mothers used her as a warning to their daughters. Fathers shook their heads and muttered about the waste of good farmland. But Ingrid was not content with her own property. In the spring of 1884, she approached her nearest neighbors, a young couple named Sven and Britta Holmberg, who had claimed the quarter section to the south. The Holmbergs were Swedish immigrants, struggling as most young homesteaders did, trying to establish themselves on land that demanded everything and forgave nothing. West, they had a 2-year-old daughter named Sonia and another child on the way. Ingrid found Sven mending a fence on a mild April morning, Fenrir trotting beside her as she walked across the prairie. Mr. Holmberg, she said, I want to dig a tunnel between our properties, a passage that would connect your root cellar to my barn, in case of emergency. Sven Holmberg was a polite young man with straw-colored hair and honest blue eyes. He set down his hammer and regarded the older woman with puzzlement. Emergency? Blizzard, fire, anything that makes going outside dangerous. If you could reach my place underground, you would have options. Shelter if yours fails. Help if you need it. The tunnel would be there. The Holmbergs exchanged glances. They had heard the stories about the mole woman, but Ingrid was offering to do all the work herself, and at no cost to them, asking nothing in return. Britta Holmberg, a practical young woman with her daughter balanced on her hip, spoke before her husband could refuse. I do not want my Sonia to lose her father the way Mrs. Ashford lost her husband. If a tunnel can prevent that, then dig your tunnel. Sven looked at his wife, then at his daughter, then at the Norwegian widow with her steady gaze and work-roughened hands. Very well, he said. You have my permission. As Ingrid turned to leave, Sven called after her. Mrs. Ashford, my father in Sweden, he dug tunnels too, between the house and the barn. I thought it was just his way. I did not know it was real knowledge. Ingrid paused and looked back at him. Something shifted in her chest, a warmth she had not felt in years. She was not alone. The old wisdom had not been forgotten entirely. Aye, it is the oldest knowledge there is, Mr. Holmberg. The earth does not forget. Only people forget. The tunnel between the properties took 5 months to complete. It was 200 feet long, properly shored and drained, with doors at each end. When it was finished, the Holmbergs could walk from their root cellar to Ingrid's barn without once seeing daylight. Word of this new tunnel rekindled the mockery. The mole woman is connecting the whole territory, Cornelius Blackwood announced with disgust at a gathering in town. First her own buildings, now her neighbors. The woman means to turn Nebraska into a rabbit warren. But something unexpected happened. The Holmbergs, despite their initial skepticism, found the tunnel useful. During a fierce thunderstorm in June of 1885, when lightning struck the prairie and fires raced across the dry grass toward their homestead, Britta took the children through the tunnel to Ingrid's stone-walled barn, while Sven fought the flames. The barn was safer than their sod house, and the tunnel let them reach it without crossing the fire's path. Britta told the other women about it at the next sewing circle. Sven mentioned it to the men at the general store. The mockery did not stop, but it grew quieter, tempered by the reluctant admission that the crazy tunnel had actually proven useful. Other neighbors began approaching Ingrid. The Kowalski family to the east, Polish immigrants with 3 strong sons, asked if she might connect their well house to the Holmberg property, creating a link in the growing chain. Old Helga Magnusson, a Norwegian widow of 71 who lived alone north of the Blackwood spread, wondered if perhaps a tunnel might reach her cabin from the Kowalski barn. She was getting too old to walk far in winter, and the isolation frightened her. Helga had recognized something in Ingrid's work that the others had not. "My father dug such tunnels in Telemark," she told Ingrid when they met for the first time, speaking in Norwegian so the American neighbors would not understand. "I thought no one in America remembered the old ways." "I remember," Ingrid said. "My grandfather taught me." "Then teach the others, before winter teaches them instead." Ingrid agreed to every request. Through 1885 and 1886, she dug. The tunnel network grew, a branching web that connected 6 homesteads, in allowing movement between properties without exposure to the elements. Each family contributed what they could, whether labor or timber, or simply meals for the woman who spent her days underground. The passages were not elegant, but they were solid. They worked. Helga Magnusson became Ingrid's closest friend. 2 Norwegian widows who understood each other's grief without needing to speak of it. They shared coffee and memories and the quiet comfort of companionship. Fenrir loved Helga, always greeting her with excited whimpers and a wagging tail when she came to visit through the tunnel. "You have done something good here," Helga told Ingrid one evening as they sat together by the fire. "Something that will outlast both of us." "I have done what my grandfather taught me," Ingrid replied. "Nothing more." "No," Helga said. "Yes, you have done what grief taught you, and that is something more indeed." Cornelius Blackwood watched the growing network with increasing irritation. The tunnels had become a kind of community project organized around the very woman he had dismissed as a lunatic. Worse, they connected the smaller homesteaders in a way that excluded him. His own property, the largest and most prosperous in the settlement, remained an island, unconnected to the web. He had been offered a connection, of course. Ingrid had approached him in the fall of 1886, proposing a tunnel that would link Blackwood's barn to the Magnusson property, completing a circuit that would connect every homestead in the eastern settlement. Blackwood received her in the parlor of his large frame house, the finest house in the territory, or with real glass windows and imported furniture. His wife Dorothea sat beside him, her face arranged in an expression of patient suffering. "Mrs. Ashford," Blackwood said, leaning back in his chair with his fingers steepled, "let me be perfectly clear. I will not participate in this foolishness. My buildings are properly constructed. My workers are capable of walking 50 feet without becoming lost. I do not need tunnels, and I will not have them dug beneath my land." Ingrid remained standing, her hat in her hands, Fenrir waiting outside on the porch. "Your land is the missing piece, Mr. Blackwood. Without a link through your property, we cannot connect the eastern settlements to the west. The network would serve more people if—" "I said no." Blackwood's voice hardened. "And I will tell you something else. If you dig so much as 1 inch on my land, I will take you to court. I will sue you for every acre you own, every tunnel you have built, and that mongrel dog of yours for good measure." He leaned forward, his eyes cold. "You are a widow, an immigrant, a woman with no family and no standing. Do you think any judge in this territory would side with you against me? Go back to your holes, Mrs. Ashford, and do not darken my door again." Ingrid looked at him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she nodded once, turned, and left without another word. Dorothea watched her go with satisfaction. "Uppity creature," she said, "coming here with her demands." "She will not trouble us again," Blackwood replied. "I have made sure of that." But later that day, as Ingrid walked home with Fenrir beside her, she passed one of Blackwood's hired men on the road. He was young, perhaps 24, with a foreign look about him and a nervous manner. "Mrs. Ashford," he said quietly, glancing back toward the Blackwood house, "my name is Peter Janssen. I am from Holland. I have heard about your tunnels." "Have you come to mock them, Mr. Janssen?" "No, ma'am. I have come to say I think they are wise. My grandmother in Rotterdam, she told stories of underground passages that saved lives in the great winters. I think you are right and Mr. Blackwood is wrong." Ingrid studied him, this young man with his earnest face and his homesick eyes. "Then why do you not say so?" Peter looked down at his boots. "Because I need this job. I send money home to my mother. Without Mr. Blackwood's wages, she will starve." He met her eyes again. "I am sorry. I wish I could help you." Ingrid reached out and touched his arm briefly. "Do not apologize for surviving, Mr. Janssen. We all do what we must." She walked on, but she did not forget him. She would remember Peter Janssen when the storm came. She would remember him for the rest of her life. Did you know that the principle Ingrid used, the fact that Earth at 5 feet deep maintains a constant temperature of 50 to 55 degrees, is today called geothermal mass? Modern passive houses still use this same principle. Knowledge from 200 years ago, still saving lives today. If you find this fascinating, hit that like button right now. It helps more than you know. The winter of 1887 to 88 began mild. December was cold but not brutal, and the snow fell in manageable amounts that the wind distributed evenly across the prairie. The homesteaders went about their business, tending stock, mending equipment, preparing for the spring that would eventually come. The talk at the general store was of prices and politics, not weather. Reverend Crane preached sermons about gratitude for the gentle season. Dr. Mercer congratulated himself on the good health of his patients. Jasper Tully collected his winnings from those who had bet against him on various matters and spent them at the saloon in town. Cornelius Blackwood surveyed his prosperous holdings with satisfaction and told anyone who would listen that this was what proper farming looked like. None of this tunnel nonsense. The network that connected 6 homesteads sat quietly beneath the frozen earth, unused and nearly forgotten. But Ingrid did not forget. She walked her tunnels every week, checking for damage, clearing debris, ensuring the doors opened smoothly. Fenrir walked beside her, his nose twitching at the scent of earth and timber. She told him stories as they walked, stories of Eric, of Norway, of all the things she carried in her heart. "We will need these passages," she told him. "Perhaps not this winter, but someday. The prairie does not forgive." Old Helga came through the tunnel to visit nearly every day. They would sit together in Ingrid's kitchen, drinking coffee, speaking Norwegian, remembering the world they had left behind. "I have a feeling," Helga said one December evening, "in my bones, something is coming." "Your bones have been right before," Ingrid replied. "They have. And that is why I trust them." January arrived, and with it came a strange, false spring. January 12th, 1888, dawned warm. Impossibly, unseasonably warm. The temperature climbed into the 40s, and the snow that had accumulated began to soften and sag. Children were sent to school in light coats, laughing at the unexpected gift. Farmers ventured out to check on stock without bundling themselves in layers. The whole prairie seemed to relax, grateful for a respite from winter's grip. But Ingrid felt the change and did not trust it. She had learned to read the prairie's moods, and this warmth felt wrong. Too sudden, too complete, like the smile of a man who was about to pull a knife. Fenrir was restless all morning, pacing from window to door and back again, whimpering at sounds only he could hear. The horses in the barn were skittish, stamping and snorting. The sky had a yellow tint that made Ingrid's stomach clench. She spent the morning checking her tunnel doors, ensuring the passages were clear, filling every lamp with oil. She brought extra firewood into the house. She checked her stores of food and water. She did everything her grandfather had taught her to do when the sky turned that particular shade of yellow. Then she walked to the Holmberg homestead through the tunnel. Britta was in her kitchen, kneading bread, her daughter Sonia playing at her feet. She was visibly pregnant now, perhaps 7 months along, moving with the careful deliberation of a woman whose body was no longer entirely her own. "Mrs. Ashford," Britta said, surprised, "what brings you here in the middle of the day? Where is Sven?" "In the far field, checking the fence line." "Why?" Ingrid looked out the window at the yellow sky. "Send one of the Kowalski boys to bring him home. Now. Today. Before dark." Britta set down her dough, her hands suddenly still. "What is wrong?" "The earth is holding its breath. Something is coming. Something bad. Keep Sonia close. Have Sven back before nightfall. And for the love of God, do not let anyone walk outside after dark." She turned and left before Britta could ask more questions. At the Kowalski homestead, she gave the same warning. At Helga's cabin, she found the old woman already packing provisions. "I felt it too," Helga said. "The same feeling I had before the storm that killed 47 people in my village. The same yellow sky." "Will you come to my place?" "No, I will stay here. The tunnel connects us. If I need you, I will come. If you need me, you know where I am." They embraced, two old women who understood what was coming. "May God protect us all," Helga whispered. "May the earth protect us," Ingrid replied. "God has never been reliable in blizzards." The storm struck in the middle of the afternoon. It arrived without warning, a wall of cold and snow that rolled across the prairie like an avalanche made of air. One moment the sky was merely yellow. The next moment it was white, solid white, as if God had drawn a curtain across the world. The temperature dropped 50 degrees in less than an hour. The wind rose from a whisper to a scream, driving snow horizontally, reducing visibility to zero. Day became darkness. The warm morning became a memory, replaced by a cold so profound it seemed to have weight, pressing down on everything it touched. Ingrid was in her barn when the blizzard hit, checking on her livestock one more time before the worst arrived. She heard the wind before she felt it, a sound like 1,000 locomotives bearing down at once. Then the barn door blew open, and the storm reached in with frozen fingers. She fought the door closed, her muscles straining against a force that seemed almost malevolent. Fenrir barked frantically, his voice lost in the howling. When the door finally latched, she leaned against it, breathing hard, ice already forming in her hair. She looked at the tunnel entrance in the corner of the barn. "Come, Fenrir," she said. "We go home now." They walked through the passage beneath the screaming wind, through the earth that held its constant 54 degrees while the world above turned to ice. When they emerged in her house, oh, the contrast was so stark it made her gasp. Warmth, safety, silence except for the muffled roar of the storm that could not reach them here. She lit a lamp and looked out the window. She could see nothing, not the barn, not the chicken coop, not even the fence post that stood 10 feet from the glass. Only white, endless, howling white. Somewhere out there, people were dying. She could feel it in her bones, the way Helga had felt it. The storm was taking lives. Right now, this very moment, people were losing their way, falling in the snow, searching for safety that remained invisible. Just like Eric. She bowed her head and prayed for the first time in years. Not to God, who had never answered her prayers about Eric. To the earth. To her grandfather. To whatever power had given her the knowledge to build these tunnels. She prayed that the tunnels would be enough. The storm is here. 31 people will survive this night. Others will not. Who do you think will be the first to come seeking help through the tunnels? Leave your prediction in the comments, then keep watching to see if you were right. The Holmberg family was the first to use the system. Sven had been in the barn when the storm hit, separated from his wife and children by 40 yards of open ground. The Kowalski boys had found him in time, brought him home through the back fields before the worst of it arrived. But now with the blizzard screaming overhead, he looked out his window at the white nothing and felt a terror he had never known. His wife, his daughter, his unborn child. They were here. They were safe. They were together. But what if something happened to the house? What if the roof collapsed under the weight of snow? What if the fire went out and they could not reach the woodpile? The tunnel, Britta said quietly. Mrs. Ashford said the tunnel would be there if we needed it. Sven lit a lantern and descended into the root cellar, then through the passage that led to Ingrid's barn. The walk took 15 minutes, hunched over in the cramped space, the lantern throwing wild shadows on the timber walls. But the earth was warm around him. The wind could not reach him here. When he emerged in Ingrid's barn, he found her already waiting. I knew you would come, she said. Is everyone well? Yes, but Britta is worried. The baby. Bring her here. Bring Sonia. My house is stronger than yours, and if something happens, I have supplies enough for all of us. Sven went back through the tunnel and returned an hour later with his pregnant wife, his young daughter, and everything they could carry. They emerged into Ingrid's kitchen like refugees from another world. Ice in their hair, fear in their eyes, but alive. Alive. At Helga Magnusson's cabin, the situation was dire. The old woman had slipped on ice that morning, before the storm arrived, and had injured her hip badly. She could not walk. She could barely move from her bed to her chair. When the blizzard struck, she lay alone in her cabin, listening to the wind tear at the walls, wondering if this was how she would die. Alone, like her husband had died 15 years before, frozen in a field he had crossed 1,000 times. Like so many others would die tonight, and within sight of homes they could not see. But Helga was not alone for long. The three Kowalski brothers, young men with strong backs and stronger hearts, came through the tunnel within an hour of the storm's arrival. They had heard about Helga's fall that morning and had worried about her all day. When the blizzard struck, they did not hesitate. They brought food and blankets and firewood, and something more precious than any of those things. They brought the simple comfort of human presence. Mrs. Magnusson, the eldest boy said, kneeling beside her bed, you are not alone. We will stay with you until this passes. For 3 days, while the storm raged overhead, the Kowalski boys stayed with Helga. They kept her fire burning. They helped her to the chamber pot when she needed it. When they told her stories about their family in Poland and listened to her stories about Norway. On the second night, when the pain in her hip made her weep, the youngest Kowalski boy held her hand and sang a Polish lullaby his mother had taught him. The words meant nothing to Helga, but the melody was universal, the melody of comfort, of care, of one human being reaching out to another in the darkness. I thought I would die alone, Helga whispered when the storm finally broke. Like my husband, like so many others. Her voice cracked. But the tunnel brought you to me. That woman and her tunnels brought you to me. She would remember the Kowalski boys for the rest of her life, and they would remember her, when the fierce old Norwegian woman who had survived the storm of '88 with nothing but a broken hip, and the knowledge that she was not forgotten. At the Blackwood homestead, there were no tunnels. Cornelius Blackwood had 4 people to account for, himself, his wife Dorothea, and his 2 hired men, Oscar Lindstrom and Peter Janssen. When the storm struck, Blackwood was in his grand house, the finest house in the territory. Oscar was in the barn, bedding down the horses. Peter was somewhere between, walking back from the well house with a bucket of water. Dorothea saw it from the window. Cornelius, she said, her voice strange, there is someone outside. Blackwood joined her at the glass, squinting into the white chaos. That fool Peter. He should have been back by now. I cannot see him. No one can see anything in this mess. He will find his way. But Peter did not find his way. The well was 80 feet from the house. 80 feet, on a path he had walked 100 times. But the blizzard erased all paths. The wind spun him around. The snow blinded him. He walked in circles, searching for a door that seemed to move every time he reached for it. The bucket of water froze in his hands. His fingers froze next, then his feet, then his face. He fell 70 feet from the barn, still clutching the bucket, still trying to find his way home. He was 24 years old. He had come to America from Holland to build a new life. He had sent money home to his mother every month without fail. He died within sight of safety, if only he could have seen it. Oscar Lindstrom, trapped in the barn, survived by burrowing into the hay and sharing warmth with the horses. He stayed there for 3 days, eating grain meant for the animals, melting snow in his hands for water. When the storm finally broke, he crawled out to find that 4 toes on his right foot had turned black. He would lose them all. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. Cornelius and Dorothea Blackwood huddled in their grand house, the largest house in the settlement, the house that was supposed to represent the pinnacle of prairie prosperity. When the coal ran out, they burned their furniture to stay warm. The imported chairs from Chicago, the carved table that had belonged to Dorothea's mother, the bookshelf filled with volumes they had never read. They had plenty of provisions, but no way to reach their other buildings, no connection to neighbors who might have helped, and no option but to wait and pray while the wind tried to tear their house apart. For 3 days they listened to the storm and thought about dying. In Ingrid's house, the scene was very different. By the end of the first day, there were 11 people gathered in her kitchen: the Holmberg family, the 3 Kowalski brothers who had come through the tunnel after ensuring Helga was safe, old Helga herself, who had insisted on being carried through the passage despite her injury, and Ingrid herself. By the second day, word had spread through the tunnel network. More families arrived, bringing children and provisions, dogs and cats, and in one case a pet goat that a young boy refused to leave behind. The house filled with warmth and noise and the particular intimacy of people surviving together. They shared meals from combined stores. They told stories to pass the time. They sang songs in 3 languages, English and Swedish and Norwegian, their voices rising against the howl of the wind that could not reach them. Old Helga taught the children a game from the old country, something with string and fingers that made them laugh despite the storm raging outside. The Kowalski boys played cards in the corner, arguing cheerfully about rules. Britta Holmberg sat in the rocking chair, her hands on her swollen belly, watching it all with tired, grateful eyes. Ingrid moved among them like a shepherd, checking that everyone had enough, that the fires were fed, that the tunnel doors were secure. Fenrir followed her everywhere, a calming presence for the frightened children who reached out to touch his soft fur. This is what I built for, she thought. This moment, these people. If only she had been able to connect to the Blackwood property. If only Cornelius had not been so proud, so sure that he knew better. She thought about Peter Janssen, the young man from Holland who had understood what she was trying to do. She prayed that he had made it inside before the worst of the storm. On the second night, Britta Holmberg went into labor. The baby was not due for another 5 weeks, but babies do not follow schedules, and this one was coming regardless of the storm above. Sven's face went white when Britta told him. He looked at Ingrid with desperate eyes. What do we do? There is no doctor, no midwife. We cannot go outside. Ingrid had helped deliver calves and foals. She had some rough knowledge of midwifery, the way all farm women did. But a human baby, 5 weeks early, in the middle of a blizzard? She took a breath and steadied herself. We do what women have done for 10,000 years, Mr. Holmberg. We bring this baby into the world. The labor was long and hard. 9 hours of Britta's muffled screams, of Sven's pacing, of the other women heating water and tearing sheets into bandages. Old Helga sat beside Britta, despite her injured hip, holding her hand, murmuring encouragement in a mix of Norwegian and Swedish. My mother gave birth in a snowstorm, Helga said. My grandmother gave birth during a war. We are strong, we women, stronger than any storm. Ingrid worked through the night, doing everything she knew, everything her mother had taught her, everything she had learned from decades of farm life. The baby was positioned wrong. It took her hours to figure out how to help. Hours of Britta's exhausted crying, and of Sven's desperate prayers, of the wind screaming overhead as if it wanted to claim this new life before it began. But the earth held, the house held, the tunnel that connected them to help and supplies and each other held. And in the gray light of a blizzard morning, a baby boy came crying into the world. He was small, too small, but his lungs were strong and his cry was loud and his little fists punched at the air as if he was already fighting. Britta, pale and exhausted, took him in her arms and wept. "He needs a name," Sven said, his own eyes wet. Britta looked at Ingrid, who stood by the bed with blood on her hands and tears on her cheeks. "Thomas," Britta said. "His name is Thomas, for the husband you lost. I mean so that his name lives on in this child who was born because of you." Ingrid had not cried in front of another person since the day she found Eric in the snow. She cried now. She took the baby in her arms and held him close. This tiny life that had entered the world beneath the earth, safe from the storm that raged above. She thought of Eric, the last time she had held him, cold and stiff in the Minnesota snow. She thought of all the years she had spent digging, all the mockery she had endured, all the lonely hours underground. It was worth it, all of it, for this moment, for this child, for these people who were alive because she refused to stop. "Welcome to the world, little Thomas," she whispered. "You were born underground, where it is safe. I hope you never need to hide from a storm. But if you do, the tunnels will be waiting." The storm broke on the morning of January 15th. Ingrid opened her door to a world transformed. The snow lay in great drifts, taller than a man in places, shaped by the wind into strange and beautiful forms. The sky was brilliant blue, scrubbed clean by 3 days of fury. The cold was still brutal, but the wind had died, and for the first time since the nightmare began, it was possible to breathe outside. 31 people emerged from Ingrid's house that morning. They stood blinking in the sunshine, their breath pluming white, their faces marked by the particular exhaustion of people who have survived something that should have killed them. They were alive, all of them. Every person who had taken shelter in the tunnel network was alive. Old Helga squeezed Ingrid's hand and said nothing. Words were not necessary. They both knew what had happened. They both knew what it meant. But across the prairie, the story was very different. The counting of the dead began that afternoon. Across the northern plains, the great blizzard of January 1888 had claimed over 200 lives. Farmers and ranchers, school teachers and children, travelers caught on the road, families who had stepped outside for just a moment and never found their way back. In Thornfield and the surrounding territory, 11 people had perished. Emmett Garrison, 17 years old, found 200 yards from his house, frozen in the act of reaching toward home. Peter Janssen, the young Dutchman, found 70 feet from the Blackwood barn, still holding the bucket of water he had been carrying when the storm swallowed him. When a family of 4 on a homestead to the west, their sod house collapsed under the weight of drifted snow. 3 children from a schoolhouse near town who had tried to walk home when the storm hit and never arrived. 2 elderly men who had lived alone and whose bodies would not be found until spring. Each death was a tragedy. Each loss left a hole in the community that would never fully heal. But in the eastern settlement, among the 6 homesteads connected by Ingrid Ashford's tunnels, not a single life was lost. 31 people had survived 3 days of white death without once stepping into the open air. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Cornelius Blackwood emerged from his grand house on the morning of January 15th and stood in the snow, looking at the ruins of his pride. His furniture was ashes in the fireplace. When his hired man, Oscar, was crippled, 4 toes sacrificed to the cold. His other hired man, Peter, who had only wanted to build a new life, was dead. He looked toward the east, toward the cluster of homesteads where 31 people had survived. He knew what had saved them. He knew who had built it. The walk to Ingrid Ashford's cabin was the longest of his life. The snow came up to his waist in places. The cold bit through his coat. His legs ached and his lungs burned, and every step was an effort that made him want to turn back. But he did not turn back. He had something to say, and it could not wait. Ingrid was outside when he arrived, clearing snow from the tunnel vents, Fenrir digging enthusiastically beside her. She looked up as he approached, and her face showed nothing. Not triumph, not anger, not satisfaction. Just the calm patience of a woman who had been waiting for this moment for 7 years. "Mrs. Ashford," Blackwood said. His voice cracked on her name. "Mr. Blackwood." He stopped a few feet away, his hands hanging at his sides. He was not a man accustomed to apology. He had never in his life admitted to being wrong about anything of consequence. But Peter was dead, 24 years old, from Holland, sending money home to his mother, Dead because Cornelius Blackwood had been too proud to let a Norwegian widow dig a tunnel under his land. Peter is dead, Blackwood said. My hired man. The young one from Holland. Ingrid's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes. I know. I am sorry. He was 70 feet from the barn. 70 feet. And he died walking 70 feet. Yes, I called you mad. The words came out like stones, hard and heavy. I laughed at your tunnels. I refused to let you dig on my land. I said you were an embarrassment to the settlement. Ingrid waited. I was wrong. The words hung in the cold air between them. I was proud and I was stupid, and a man is dead because of it. A young man with his whole life ahead of him. Dead because I thought I knew better than a widow who was only trying to save lives. He looked down at the snow. I cannot undo what I did. I cannot bring Peter back. But I can. His voice broke. I can learn. I can change. I can stop being the fool I have been. He raised his eyes to hers. Will you teach me? Will you let me dig tunnels on my property? And will you connect me to your network so that no one else dies on my land the way Peter died? Ingrid studied him for a long moment. This man who had mocked her for 7 years. This man who had threatened to sue her, to take her farm, to take her dog. This man whose pride had cost a young immigrant his life. He was not the same man who had sneered at her from his parlor. That man would never have knelt in the snow. That man would never have admitted fault. I do not want your money, she said finally, and I will not dig tunnels only for your property. The network needs to connect everyone, or it does not work. You were the missing piece. Without a link through your land, we could not reach the homesteads to the west. She paused. If you agree to let me dig across your property, a main passage that connects the eastern network to the western settlers, I will help you build whatever tunnels you need for yourself. No charge, just cooperation. Blackwood's eyes filled with tears. He was not a man who cried. He had not cried since he was a boy. But something broke in him at that moment, some wall that had held for decades, and the tears came despite everything he did to stop them. Yes, he whispered, whatever you need. Yes. Cornelius Blackwood spent 7 years mocking Ingrid, 7 years refusing to listen. Then he knelt in the snow and asked her to teach him. Have you ever known someone who took that long to admit they were wrong? Like this video, if this story has made you think about the people in your own life. A gathering was held at the schoolhouse 2 weeks after the blizzard. Mushrish when the dead had been buried and the injured had begun to heal. The settlement came together to mourn the 11 souls who had been lost, including young Emmett Garrison and Peter Janssen, and the family of 4 whose house had collapsed. But they also came to acknowledge what had been saved. Mayor Wilkins, who served as the informal leader of the Thornfield community, addressed the assembly with a gravity that the occasion demanded. 31 people survived the storm in the eastern settlement, he said. 31 people who were able to move between homesteads, share resources, help each other, without once stepping into the killing wind. They survived because one woman, 7 years ago, started digging tunnels that the rest of us called madness. He turned to Ingrid, who stood at the back of the room with Fenrir at her feet, as uncomfortable with attention as she had ever been. Mrs. Ashford, you lost your husband to a blizzard. You could have let that loss destroy you. Instead, you let it teach you. You built something that saved lives, including the lives of people who laughed at you, who mocked you, who called you mad. His voice thickened. We were wrong, all of us, and we are grateful. Reverend Crane rose next. The minister looked older than he had before the storm, as if the 3 days of howling wind had aged him years. I stood in this very building and said that Mrs. Ashford's tunnels were against God's will, he said. I said that living beneath the earth was contrary to divine design. He shook his head slowly. I was a fool. If anyone in this room understands God's will, it is the woman who used the earth he created to save his children. I apologize, Mrs. Ashford. I was wrong, and I am sorry. Dr. Mercer spoke next, his face red with shame. I told people the air in underground tunnels was poisonous. I said Mrs. Ashford would develop consumption. I was wrong on both counts. She is healthier than I am, and the 31 people who sheltered in her network showed no ill effects from their time underground. As a man of science, I should have studied her methods instead of dismissing them. I apologize. Young Jasper Tully shuffled to the front, his hat in his hands. I bet $5 she would give up before the first snow, he said. I lost that bet. I should have lost it happily. Mrs. Ashford, I am sorry for making light of your work. I owe you more than $5. I owe you respect. One by one, others rose. Oh, families who had laughed at the tunnels and then survived because of them. Neighbors who had whispered about the mole woman and then sent their children through her passages to safety. Each one offered their acknowledgement, their apology, their thanks. When the confessions were complete, Cornelius Blackwood rose from his seat. The room fell silent. Everyone knew what he had said about Ingrid over the years. Everyone knew he had refused to let her dig on his land. Everyone knew about Peter Janssen. Blackwood walked to the front of the schoolhouse. He was a tall man, proud and prosperous, but he seemed smaller now, diminished, humbled by a lesson that should never have needed teaching. I led the mockery, he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. I called her the mole woman. I refused to let her dig on my land. I told her if she touched my property, I would sue her for everything she owned. He stopped, drew a breath. My hired man is dead because of my pride. Peter Janssen. He came from Holland to make a new life. He sent money home to his mother every month. He was 70 feet from the barn when he died. His voice cracked. 70 feet. If I had let Mrs. Ashford dig her tunnel, he would have walked underground. He would have reached the barn. He would have lived. He turned to face Ingrid. I cannot undo what I did. I cannot bring him back. But I can tell you before everyone here that I was wrong. I was a fool and a coward and a prideful man who thought he knew better than everyone else. And I am sorry. He bowed his head. I am so sorry. The room was silent. Then slowly someone began to clap. Then another. Then another. Not for Blackwood, but for the truth he had finally spoken. For the courage it took to say it. For the hope that perhaps this community could learn from its mistakes. When the applause faded, Ingrid walked to the front of the schoolhouse. She was not a woman of words. She had never been comfortable with speeches, but some things needed to be said, and she was the only one who could say them. My husband died 18 yards from our front door, she said quietly. 18 yards. I found him the next morning with his hand outstretched, searching for a home he could not see. She looked around the room at all the faces watching her. Neighbors who had mocked her, friends who had believed in her, children who would grow up in a world changed by what she had built. And I have thought about that distance every day for 9 years. Her voice was steady, but tears ran down her weathered cheeks. The tunnels are not madness. They are memory. They are my promise to Eric that no one else will die the way he died. She paused. I will teach anyone who wishes to learn. The digging is hard, but it is not complicated. The materials are not expensive. The work can be shared. Every homestead in this settlement can be connected if we do it together. She drew a breath. The storm will come again. It always does. The question is whether we will be ready. That summer, Thornfield began to dig. Under Ingrid's supervision, the tunnel network expanded from 6 connected homesteads to 17. The main passage through Blackwood's land, the link that joined the eastern and western portions of the settlement, was completed in August, creating a continuous underground route that stretched nearly a mile. Cornelius Blackwood worked alongside the crews, swinging a pick and hauling dirt, doing the labor he had once considered beneath him. His hands blistered and bled and calloused over. His back ached. His muscles screamed. But he did not stop. He could not stop. Every shovelful of dirt was a prayer for Peter Janssen. Every timber he placed was an apology he could never adequately express. His wife Dorothea stayed as well. She had wanted to leave after the storm, to return to civilization, to forget the horror of those 3 days burning furniture to survive. But something changed in her as she watched her husband transform from a proud landowner into a humble student. She began bringing water and food to the digging crews, and she began sitting with Ingrid, learning about the old ways, about the knowledge that had been passed down through generations in Norway and Sweden and Poland and all the other places where winter could kill. She stopped gossiping. She started listening. The phrase digging in Ashford entered the vocabulary of the Nebraska prairie. It meant building connections between people, creating passages that would hold when the surface failed. It was spoken with quiet respect, as if the speaker understood something about foresight that could only be learned through loss. The years passed. Ingrid grew older, but she did not slow down. Every winter she walked her tunnels, checking for damage, ensuring the passages were ready for whatever might come. Fenrir walked beside her until he could walk no more. Until the old dog died in the spring of 1895, 15 years old, tired and content. Ingrid buried him beside the entrance to the first tunnel she had ever dug, the passage connecting her house to her barn. She carved a simple marker from cottonwood, Fenrir, 1880 to 1895. He walked with me through the darkness. He never left my side. She wept for him as she had wept for Eric. Then she dried her eyes and went back to work. There was always work to be done. The Great Blizzard of 1899 struck the same territory with similar fury. By then, the Thornfield network included 32 connected homesteads with over 3 miles of underground passages linking them together. Not a single life was lost in the settlement. The storm killed dozens across the plains, but in Thornfield the tunnels held. Families moved through the darkness with lanterns, sharing food and warmth, helping each other as they had learned to do 11 years before. Ingrid was 60 years old. Her hair had gone white. Her hands were gnarled with arthritis. But she still walked her tunnels every winter, still checked every door, still remembered why she had built them. Little Thomas Holmberg, the baby born underground during the storm of '88, was 11 years old now. A bright, curious boy who loved to help Ingrid with her inspections. He had been born in the tunnels and he understood them in a way that other children did not. "Mrs. Ashford," he asked her one day, "why did you keep digging even when everyone laughed at you?" Ingrid looked at him, this child who carried the name of her lost husband, he who had entered the world in the darkness beneath the earth. "Because I knew something they did not know, Thomas. I knew what it felt like to find someone you love frozen in the snow. I knew I could not let that happen to anyone else. But what if you had been wrong? What if the tunnels had not worked?" Ingrid smiled. "Then I would have died knowing I had tried. That is all any of us can do, Thomas. Try, build, hope, and never stop, no matter how many people tell us we are mad." Thomas nodded solemnly. "I want to build tunnels when I grow up. Then I will teach you everything I know." Ingrid Ashford died in the spring of 1904 at the age of 65. She passed in her sleep peacefully in the house she had built with her own hands, surrounded by the entrances to tunnels that had saved more lives than anyone could count. But her last request, written in a shaky hand in the final weeks of her life, was simple. "Take me home to Minnesota. Bury me beside Eric. We have been apart long enough." The community honored her wish. They transported her body across the plains to the homestead where her husband had died 25 years before, and they laid her to rest beside him in the small cemetery on the hill. The headstone they placed there read, "Ingrid Ashford, 1839 to 1904. She built paths where there were none." Eric, searching in the darkness, finally found his way home. In Thornfield, the settlement placed a marker at the entrance to the first tunnel Ingrid had ever dug, the passage connecting her house to her barn. The Ashford Tunnel, built 1881. The earth does not forget, only people forget, in memory of Ingrid Ashford, who remembered. Why the tunnels remained in use for decades, maintained by the children and grandchildren of the people who had survived the Great Blizzard. They became a point of local pride, a reminder of what one woman's determination could accomplish, a testament to the power of listening to those who know what they're talking about. In 1978, engineers from the University of Nebraska came to study what remained of the Thornfield network. They were researching historical methods of surviving extreme cold, and they had heard stories about the Norwegian widow who had built tunnels beneath the prairie. What they found astonished them. The principles Ingrid had used, geothermal mass, subterranean passages below the frost line, earth-sheltered construction, were the same principles that modern passive houses employed. The temperatures they measured in the surviving tunnels matched exactly what Ingrid's grandfather had promised, a constant 54 degrees, regardless of the weather above. 2 centuries of engineering progress, and the best modern science could do was validate what a Norwegian farmer had known in 1800. The engineers published a paper about their findings. They called Ingrid Ashford a pioneer of sustainable design, and an early practitioner of earth-sheltered architecture. They praised her foresight, her determination, her refusal to abandon traditional knowledge in the face of modernization. The last working section of the Ashford Tunnel network was filled in during 1952 when a new highway was routed through the area. The engineers who did the filling found the passages remarkably well preserved. Why the timber shoring still solid after 70 years, the gravel floors still draining properly. One section was saved. It was relocated to the Douglas County Historical Museum, where it remains today. A small exhibit explains the history of the tunnels and the woman who built them. There is a photograph of Ingrid, stern-faced and weathered, taken sometime in the 1890s. There is a reproduction of the marker that stood at the entrance to her first tunnel. There is a letter from Thomas Holmberg, written in 1942, describing what it was like to be born underground during the Great Blizzard. "I came into this world in the darkness beneath the earth," he wrote, "surrounded by people who loved each other, protected by walls that one woman had built with her own hands. I have never feared storms. Oh, I have never feared the dark, because I know that when the worst comes, there are passages that lead to safety. We just have to be wise enough to build them." Thomas lived to be 93 years old. He died in 1981, the last living person who had been present in Ingrid's house during the blizzard of 1888. His final words, according to his daughter, were simple. "Tell Mrs. Ashford thank you." They called her mad because she dug beneath the earth. They called her Mole Woman. They bet against her and laughed at her and told her she was an embarrassment to the settlement. 7 years later, they called her the woman who saved their lives. But Ingrid never cared about the names they used. She only cared about 18 yards. 18 yards between Eric and the door he could not find. In 18 yards that had haunted her dreams for a quarter century, she turned those 18 yards into miles of tunnels, into 31 lives saved, into a legacy that would outlast everyone who had ever mocked her. She turned her grief into a gift. And somewhere, in whatever place the dead go to rest, Eric Ashford finally found his way home. Not through 18 yards of blizzard-swept snow, but through the passages his wife had built in his memory, through the earth that does not forget, through love that outlasts even death. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. And remember, sometimes what looks like madness is simply preparation that others have not yet understood. The tunnels are still there, in waiting beneath the earth, ready for the next storm. Will you be ready too? The end.